Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. The town of Black Hollow had always been shrouded in mystery. Its centerpiece was an ancient bell tower that stood atop a hill, visible from every corner of the small village. The tower's origins were lost to time, and its bell, known as the Hollow Bell, was said to have been forged in the 16th century by a reclusive blacksmith who had vanished shortly after completing it. Though no one in Black Hollow could recall a time when the bell had been rung by human hands, its toll echoed through the valley on occasion, deep and resonant, sending chills down the spines of everyone who heard it. The strangest part? The tower had been locked for as long as anyone could remember. According to local legend, the bell was cursed. It was said that whenever the hollow bell rang, someone in the town would meet a tragic end. Some claimed it was a harbinger of death. Others believed it was a warning from the spirits who guarded the town. For generations, the townsfolk avoided the tower, and superstitions grew. Children were forbidden from playing near it, and even on sunny days, the hill remained eerily quiet. Then one crisp autumn evening, the bell rang. The tolling came without warning, its deep, mournful sound reverberating through the town. It seemed to last forever, each chime growing louder and more oppressive. People froze where they stood, their faces pale with fear. The next morning, a stranger arrived in Black Hollow. He introduced himself as Nathaniel Ward, a historian and folklorist. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes and a leather satchel filled with notebooks, he claimed to be researching the legends of cursed bells. The townsfolk were wary of Nathaniel, but curiosity won over fear, and they allowed him to stay at the local inn. It didn't take long for him to discover that no one had ever ventured into the bell tower. Nathaniel spent his days poring over old documents in the town library, unearthing fragmented stories about the bell and its creator. One journal mentioned that the blacksmith had been plagued by nightmares during the forging, as if the metal itself resisted being shaped. Another hinted that the bell's final toll had been for the blacksmith himself. Determined to uncover the truth, Nathaniel announced his intention to enter the tower. "You'll bring ruin upon us all," cried Agnes Carter, an elderly woman known for her knowledge of local lore. "That bell doesn't ring by mortal hands. It's best left alone." But Nathaniel was undeterred. The night before Nathaniel planned to investigate the tower, the bell rang again. This time it was accompanied by an unnatural wind that howled through the town, rattling windows and extinguishing lanterns. Nathaniel stood outside, staring up at the bell tower. He could see the bell swinging in the moonlight, its movement slow and deliberate, though no one was there to pull the rope. The next morning, news spread that the butcher's apprentice had been found dead in the woods, his face frozen in an expression of terror. Undeterred, Nathaniel made his way to the tower. A crowd gathered to watch as he used tools to pry open the rusted lock. The heavy door creaked open, revealing a staircase spiraling into darkness. Armed with a lantern, Nathaniel ascended. The air inside was damp and thick with the scent of decay. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, their meaning lost to time. When he reached the top, he found the bell. It was massive, its bronze surface tarnished and covered in more symbols. The rope that should have been used to ring it lay coiled and untouched. As he examined the bell, a chilling wind swept through the room, extinguishing his lantern. In the darkness, he heard a faint whisper. Nathaniel lit his lantern again, but the room felt different. The whispers grew louder, an eerie chorus of voices that seemed to emanate from the bell itself. He leaned closer, and for a moment, he thought he saw shapes moving within the polished surface of the bell. Faces twisted in agony. Then the bell rang. The sound was deafening, reverberating through Nathaniel's entire body. He staggered back, clutching his ears as the room seemed to warp around him. The whispers became screams, and the symbols on the walls glowed with an otherworldly light. Nathaniel stumbled out of the tower, pale and trembling. He gathered the townsfolk and revealed what he had learned. The bell had been cursed by the blacksmith's final act. Desperate to save his dying child, the blacksmith had made a pact with a malevolent spirit. In exchange for his child's life, the blacksmith would forge a vessel to contain the spirit's power, a bell that would serve as a gateway between worlds. But the spirit had tricked him. The child had died anyway, and the blacksmith's soul had been bound to the bell along with countless others. Nathaniel believed the only way to stop the bell was to destroy it. The townsfolk were hesitant, fearing the consequences of tampering with such a powerful object. But after another toll claimed the life of a young farmer, they agreed to help. Using sledgehammers and fire, they worked tirelessly to dismantle the bell. As the first crack appeared in its surface, an ear-piercing wail erupted, and the entire tower began to shake. When the bell finally shattered, a blinding light filled the tower, and the screams ceased. The pieces of the bell dissolved into ash, carried away by the wind. For the first time in centuries, the tower was silent. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over Black Hollow lifted, and the townsfolk felt as though a great weight had been removed. Nathaniel left the town soon after, his work complete. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits weren't entirely gone. Sometimes when the wind howled, he thought he heard the faint echo of a bell, ringing in the distance. In the heart of the bustling city of Greyhaven lay an anomaly. Whispering Row, a narrow street so devoid of life it seemed misplaced amidst the surrounding chaos. The street was perpetually silent, its cobblestones dark and worn, yet oddly pristine, as if untouched by the grime that plagued the rest of the city. Locals avoided it, whispering tales of eerie happenings. They claimed footsteps on Whispering Row never echoed, no matter how loud the world outside might be. Even the sound of the wind, so common in Greyhaven's winding alleys, died in the air upon reaching the street. It was said that those who ventured too far into Whispering Row often disappeared, leaving behind no trace but an unsettling chill in the air. Lila was new to Greyhaven, a writer seeking inspiration in the city's storied streets. Her tiny apartment overlooked Whispering Row, though she had yet to set foot there. Her landlord, an elderly man with a wary demeanor, had warned her on the day she moved in. "Stay away from that street," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It's not meant for the living." Lila dismissed the warning as a superstition, the sort of story cities invented to entertain themselves. Yet night after night, she found herself drawn to her window, staring at the silent street below. The cobblestones seemed to glisten under the moonlight, and an inexplicable pull grew stronger with each passing day. Unable to resist her curiosity, Lila decided to explore Whispering Row. She stepped onto the street on a crisp autumn morning, the air heavy with anticipation. The silence hit her like a wall. The city's usual hum of activity vanished the moment her foot touched the first cobblestone. Even the sound of her own breathing seemed muted, her footsteps swallowed by the oppressive quiet. The street was lined with old buildings, their windows dark and lifeless. Dust motes floated in the air, visible in the dim light filtering through the overcast sky. As she walked, she felt the weight of unseen eyes on her back. She turned, but the street was empty. At the far end of the street, Lila found an abandoned shop. Its door hung slightly ajar, revealing a room filled with forgotten objects, cracked porcelain, faded photographs, and dusty books. On a small table sat a leather-bound journal. It was unmarked and thick with age, its pages filled with neat handwriting that seemed to shimmer faintly under the dim light. The entries described Whispering Row in haunting detail. The writer, someone named Margaret, claimed the street was cursed, a thin veil between the living and the dead. "The silence is their domain," one entry read. "They walk with us, unseen, unheard. But if you linger too long, they may take notice. That night, Lila couldn't sleep. The journal's words haunted her. She dreamed of shadowy figures moving silently along the street, their forms indistinct and shifting. When she awoke, the dream felt more like a memory. Compelled by a force she didn't understand, she returned to Whispering Row at dusk, clutching the journal. This time the silence was heavier, oppressive. As she walked, the shadows in the windows seemed to move, their forms flickering like candlelight. She froze when she saw the first figure, a man standing in the middle of the street, his face obscured by darkness. He didn't move, didn't breathe. When she blinked, he was gone. Lila spent days unraveling the journal's mysteries. Margaret had chronicled her descent into madness, claiming that Whispering Row was alive, feeding on sound and drawing in the curious. The footsteps don't echo because the street swallows them, Margaret had written. Every sound is a piece of you it takes. Margaret's final entry was chilling. They've noticed me. I hear them in the silence now, whispering my name. Tomorrow I'll walk the street one last time. If I'm not back, know that I am one of them. One stormy evening, Lila stood at the edge of Whispering Row, clutching the journal tightly. Lightning illuminated the street, revealing fleeting glimpses of figures standing in the windows, their faces pale and blurred. The silence was deafening, pressing against her ears like a physical weight. She called out, her voice muffled and distorted, as if the air itself resisted sound. She took a step forward and then another. Her voice disappeared entirely, swallowed by the street. The figures grew clearer, their faces contorted in silent screams. When she turned to leave, the entrance to the street was gone. The deeper Lila ventured, the stranger the street became. The buildings seemed to twist and bend, their walls closing in. The cobblestones beneath her feet felt warm, pulsing like a heartbeat. The figures surrounded her now, moving closer with each step. They didn't speak, but their silence screamed louder than any sound. In her final moments, Lila understood the truth. Whispering Row wasn't just a street, it was a gateway, a liminal space where the living and the dead collided. Lila's disappearance became another story whispered among the townsfolk of Greyhaven. Her apartment was cleared out, her belongings scattered, and the journal lost. Yet her ghostly silhouette was often seen on Whispering Row, walking silently among the other lost souls. And the street remained as it always was, silent, watching, waiting for its next visitor. In a small, forgotten shop tucked away between two crumbling buildings in the heart of a city that had long since been abandoned by time, there was an old, dust-covered display case. It was filled with peculiar items, odd trinkets, antique mirrors, faded paintings, and strange carvings. But amidst these curiosities was something far more captivating, a mask. The mask was no ordinary object. It was crafted from smooth, polished ebony wood, the surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. It was an unnerving, haunting mask, one that held an air of mystery that most would dare not confront. The eyes of the mask were hollow, its mouth open in a perpetual, silent scream. The shopkeeper, an elderly man whose eyes glinted with a peculiar light, had often watched patrons pass by his shop, never once daring to enter. He'd grown accustomed to the avoidance, but one day a young woman named Ilara entered the shop. Her long brown hair cascaded down her back, her eyes tired but curious, searching for something that would shake her from the monotony of her life. "Can I help you?" the shopkeeper asked, his voice dry and cracked, like the pages of an old book. Ilara stepped closer to the display case, her fingers brushing against the glass. "What's this?" she inquired, pointing at the mask. "That..." The shopkeeper paused, his expression shifting into something darker. "That is no ordinary mask. It's special. It has a way of calling to certain people. Perhaps you are one of them." Elara felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as if it were meant for her. She leaned in closer, drawn by its beauty and its mystery. How much? The shopkeeper gave a strange smile, his eyes gleaming unnaturally. It is not about the price, my dear. It is about the choice. Once you wear it, you cannot remove it. The mask will become a part of you, and you will never be the same. Elara hesitated, but the weight of curiosity pressed against her chest. She had always lived a life of ordinariness, of dull routines and quiet moments that never seemed to change. The mask called to something deep within her, a longing for transformation, for something that could release her from her mundane existence. I'll take it, she said, her voice firm. I'm ready. The shopkeeper's smile widened, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he took the mask from its case. The air grew colder as he handed it to her. That evening, as Elara sat in her modest apartment, the mask resting in her hands, she marveled at its beauty. She knew deep down that once she put it on, there would be no going back. The fear she had felt earlier now seemed distant, overshadowed by the undeniable pull the mask had on her. She stared into the hollow eyes of the mask, her reflection distorted within them. Something about the way it looked back at her sent a chill down her spine. But it was a thrill, too. The mask promised something she couldn't yet name, something beyond the ordinary. With a deep breath, Elara pressed the mask to her face. The cool wood was smooth against her skin as she adjusted it, the edges fitting perfectly around her features. For a moment, she felt nothing but the weight of the mask, a slight pressure against her skull. But then, the change began. At first, it was subtle. Her vision blurred as if a veil had descended over her eyes. A sharp, painful sensation spread through her face, her skin tingling as though it was being altered. She reached up, intending to remove the mask, but her hands froze. The mask had fused to her skin. Panic surged through her chest as she clawed at the edges, but they wouldn't budge. The mask had sealed itself onto her face, as though it had always belonged there. She stumbled backward, her breathing quick and shallow, but the mask remained. A cold, unfamiliar voice whispered in her mind, its words incomprehensible. It was as if the mask had a consciousness of its own, a consciousness that now shared a space within her mind. Elara's life began to unravel after that night. The mask, which had once promised her transformation, now kept her trapped in a world where reality seemed distant and distorted. She no longer recognized her own reflection in mirrors. The mask, now a permanent fixture on her face, seemed to distort her features, making her appear both familiar and foreign. The hollow eyes stared back at her, unblinking and empty, as if she were no longer herself, but something else entirely. At night, Elara could hear the whispers, faint and eerie, as though the mask itself was communicating with her. The voice that had spoken to her in the beginning now seemed to grow stronger, more insistent. It began to tell her things, dark, twisted truths about the world she had never known. The mask had unlocked a deep well of knowledge, but it was not the kind of wisdom she had hoped for. It was knowledge of pain, of suffering, of secrets buried long ago. Every time she attempted to remove the mask, her hands would tremble, and an overwhelming sensation of dread would wash over her. The mask had become a part of her, fusing with her very essence. She could no longer escape it, no longer separate herself from the identity it had created. Days turned into weeks, and Elara's life began to crumble. Her relationships with friends and family deteriorated as she became more and more withdrawn, more consumed by the presence of the mask. She tried to reach out, tried to speak to those around her, but her words were muffled, as if she were speaking from beneath the surface of a still pond. No one could hear her anymore. Her mind fractured, torn between the whispers of the mask and the fading remnants of her own identity. Every reflection she saw in glass and mirrors was more foreign, more haunting. The mask had taken her face, her voice, and now it was taking her soul. One fateful evening, Elara wandered the empty streets, her footsteps silent on the cobblestones. The city felt different, the air thick with a weight she could not escape. It was as if the mask had begun to affect the world around her, bending reality to its will. As she walked, the whispers in her mind grew louder, more demanding. They spoke of a fate she had not yet fully understood. The mask was not just an object, but a prison for the soul, one that would slowly consume her until she became nothing more than a shadow of her former self. The voice in her mind, now clearer than ever, urged her to embrace her new identity, to surrender completely to the mask. It promised her power, wisdom, and an eternal life free from the constraints of human limitations. But in exchange, she would lose herself entirely. She would become a vessel for the mask's will, a puppet for an ancient force that had long since passed into the shadows. Elara paused in her steps, the weight of the mask pressing down on her. She could feel her sanity slipping away, her sense of self fraying at the edges. The mask had given her everything she had wanted, but at a price she was not prepared to pay. She had become a prisoner of her own desire for something greater, something more. One last time, Elara stood before a mirror, her eyes locked on the reflection that was no longer her own. The mask loomed large, dark, and hollow, a grotesque version of her face. Her features were unrecognizable, twisted into something unnatural. The whispers in her mind became deafening. They demanded she give in, to fully surrender to the mask's power. They promised her a life of immortality, of control, of endless wisdom. But she would no longer be herself. She would be consumed. With trembling hands, Elara reached up to the mask once again. But this time, something inside her resisted. A flicker of the woman she had once been, the woman who had wanted to break free from the mundane, the woman who had dared to wear the mask, still remained. She realized that the mask had never been a tool for self-discovery. It had always been a trap, a way to steal her soul bit by bit. But it was too late. The mask had already taken root too deep. As Elara's consciousness slipped away entirely, she knew that she was lost, that she would never escape the mask. And so with her final breath, she whispered a single word, one last plea for freedom. Please. And then there was silence. The shopkeeper's eyes flickered with a knowing gleam as he watched another victim pass by the window. The mask had done its work once again, and the cycle would continue. There would always be those who sought more, who wished for the impossible, who would fall prey to the mask's insidious lure. Elara's face, now forever molded into the mask's form, would soon be added to the collection of those who had been consumed, who had become mere echoes of their former selves, trapped in an endless existence of silence. And the mask would wait patiently for the next soul willing to make the same choice. Blackwood Hollow was a small, secluded village nestled deep within an ancient forest. Time seemed to move slower there, as if the village had been forgotten by the modern world. Its cobblestone streets were lined with crooked houses, their roofs sagging under the weight of centuries. The townsfolk were wary of outsiders, and whispers of old superstitions echoed through the taverns and marketplaces. At the heart of Blackwood Hollow, hidden within a clearing in the forest, stood the wishing well. Its stones were covered in thick moss, and vines twisted around its structure like tendrils of a serpent. The well had been there for as long as anyone could remember, its origins shrouded in mystery. Some said it was older than the village itself, built by the hands of ancient druids or witches. Others claimed it was cursed by a vengeful spirit. What everyone agreed upon was this: the well had the power to grant wishes, but at a terrible price. The well's legend was a cautionary tale passed down through generations. It was said that those who tossed a coin into its depths and whispered their desires would have their wishes granted. But the wishes never came true as one expected. They were always twisted, corrupted by the well's malevolent will. Lena was a young woman who had grown up in Blackwood Hollow, her life shaped by hardship and loss. Her parents had died when she was a child, leaving her to be raised by her cruel aunt. Now in her early 20s, Lena worked tirelessly in the village bakery, her hands blistered from kneading dough, and her spirit weighed down by the monotony of her existence. She had heard the stories of the wishing well, of course. Everyone in the village had. But desperation had a way of making people reckless, and Lena was no exception. One cold autumn evening, after another grueling day at work, she decided to visit the well. Her heart pounded as she made her way through the dense forest, the trees casting long, eerie shadows in the moonlight. When she reached the clearing, the well loomed before her, its dark mouth gaping like a silent void. She clutched a single silver coin in her hand, her knuckles white with tension. "I wish for freedom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Freedom from this life." The coin tumbled into the darkness, the sound of it hitting the water echoing faintly. For a moment there was silence, and then a cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a faint, haunting whisper. "Granted." Lena shivered, her heart racing. She hurried back to the village, her mind filled with both hope and unease. The next morning, Lena awoke to find the bakery in chaos. Her aunt had vanished without a trace. At first, Lena felt a surge of relief. Her aunt had been a cruel and domineering figure, the source of much of Lena's misery. But as the days passed, her relief turned to unease. The villagers whispered about the disappearance, their voices tinged with suspicion. Lena began to notice strange things. At night, she heard faint whispers coming from the forest, as if the trees themselves were murmuring secrets. The air around her felt colder, heavier. And then the dreams began. In her dreams, Lena stood by the well, its dark waters swirling with shadows. A figure emerged from the depths, a woman with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. The figure spoke in a voice that echoed like the wind through the trees. "Freedom comes at a cost." Lena woke each time drenched in sweat, the woman's voice lingering in her mind. She tried to dismiss the dreams as mere nightmares, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She began to see glimpses of her aunt's face in the shadows, her expression twisted in anguish. Consumed by fear and guilt, Lena returned to the well. She needed to undo what she had done. She clutched another silver coin in her hand, her fingers trembling as she approached the clearing. The well seemed darker, more menacing than before. "I wish to bring my aunt back," Lena whispered, her voice cracking. The coin disappeared into the depths, and the wind stirred once more. This time the whisper was louder, more sinister. "Granted." Lena hurried back to the village, her heart heavy with dread. That night she was awakened by a sound she hadn't heard in weeks, the creak of her aunt's bedroom door. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Slowly she crept down the hall and peeked into the room. Her aunt was standing by the window, her back turned to Lena. But something was wrong. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as if she were a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. When her aunt turned around, Lena stifled a scream. Her face was pale and lifeless, her eyes hollow and unseeing. Her lips twisted into a grotesque smile. "You brought me back," her aunt said, her voice distorted and echoing. "But I'm not the same." Lena fled the house, her mind racing. She had made a terrible mistake. Over the following days, Lena's life descended into a nightmare. Her aunt followed her everywhere, her lifeless eyes watching Lena's every move. The villagers began to notice, their whispers growing louder. They avoided Lena, their fear evident. Desperate for answers, Lena sought out the oldest resident of Blackwood Hollow, a blind woman named Agnes, who was said to know the village's darkest secrets. Agnes listened to Lena's story with a grave expression. "The well is cursed," Agnes said. "It was created by a powerful witch long ago, a woman scorned by the village. She poured all her hatred and pain into the well, binding her soul to it. It grants wishes, yes, but only by twisting them into nightmares. Lena's heart sank. What can I do? Agnes shook her head. There is no undoing a wish once it is granted. The well's power cannot be reversed. Lena knew there was only one thing left to do. She returned to the well one final time, her hands trembling as she clutched the last coin she owned. I wish for this to end, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I wish to undo it all. The coin fell into the darkness, and the wind howled around her. The whisper came again, colder than ever. Granted. The ground beneath her feet began to shake, and the well's waters bubbled violently. Shadows rose from the depths, swirling around her. Lena felt herself being pulled into the darkness, her body growing weightless. As the shadows consumed her, the whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices echoing in her mind. And then, there was silence. When the villagers ventured into the forest days later, they found the well untouched, its dark waters still. But Lena was gone, and so was her aunt. The legend of the wishing well grew darker, the villagers warning future generations to stay away. Yet the well remained, waiting patiently for the next desperate soul to toss in a coin and make a wish. For the well always granted wishes, but never without a cost. It began on an unremarkable autumn evening in the quiet town of Evergrove. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets and golden leaf trees. Lila Marston, a young artist with a penchant for sketching in the twilight, sat on a bench in the town's central park. Her sketchbook rested on her lap, her charcoal pencil moving swiftly across the page. The park was nearly deserted, save for the occasional jogger or dog walker. But as the sun dipped lower, Lila noticed something unusual. A shadow stretched across the pavement in front of her, not cast by her or the nearby lampposts. It was too large, too fluid, and moved as if it had a will of its own. She looked around, expecting to see someone nearby. The path was empty. The shadow had no owner. Her chest tightened. She quickly packed her things and left, convincing herself it was a trick of the light, a figment of her overactive imagination. But as she walked home, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was following her. That night, Lila tried to sleep, but the unease lingered. The sound of rustling leaves outside her window felt louder, more deliberate. At one point, she thought she saw a flicker of movement in the corner of her bedroom, a faint outline darker than the surrounding shadows. The next morning, she found smudged charcoal marks on her sketchbook, though she was certain she hadn't touched it since the park. Her latest drawing, a serene depiction of the park bench, now featured a strange shadow stretching across the page, dark and distorted. Maybe I drew it without realizing, she murmured. But even as she said it, she didn't believe herself. Lila wasn't the only one noticing strange occurrences in Evergrove. At the local coffee shop, snippets of conversation floated around about eerie shadows appearing in the most unexpected places. On ceilings where no light could cast them, in reflections, or following people home at night. Mrs. Thorne, the elderly librarian, swore she saw a shadow lingering near her shelves long after closing. It moved even though nothing was there, she whispered to anyone who would listen. A young boy claimed his own shadow had disappeared for hours, replaced by one that was too tall and didn't move the way it should. Leela listened, her heart racing. She kept quiet about her own experience, but started paying closer attention. Days turned into weeks, and Lila couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. The shadow appeared often now, on the walls of her apartment, stretching unnaturally or lingering in corners where light should have erased it. It never moved when she stared directly at it, but in her peripheral vision, it seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. One evening, she decided to confront it. Armed with a flashlight, she waited in her living room, the lights dimmed. Hours passed in tense silence until finally the shadow emerged, pooling on the floor near her bookshelf. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The shadow didn't respond, but as she shone the flashlight toward it, the beam seemed to bend, absorbed into the darkness. Her heart pounded as she realized the shadow wasn't merely a trick of the light, it was something alive. Desperate for answers, Lila visited Mrs. Thorne at the library. The elderly woman, known for her knowledge of the town's history, listened intently to Lila's story before nodding gravely. "There's an old tale," Mrs. Thorne said, pulling a dusty book from the archives, "about a shadow that doesn't belong to anyone. It's said to be the remnant of someone who lost their soul, a punishment for a deal gone wrong or a terrible sin. This shadow roams seeking a new master. It latches onto those it finds suitable." "Suitable for what?" Lila asked, dread creeping into her voice. "For taking its place." Mrs. Thorne gave Lila a grim warning. "The longer it stays with you, the stronger its hold becomes. You mustn't let it consume you. Shadows thrive on fear, guilt, and regret." Layla tried to follow the advice to ignore the shadow and live her life as normally as possible, but it was impossible to escape. It grew bolder, appearing in broad daylight, slithering across walls and floors like a living entity. Sometimes it mimicked her movements, other times it didn't. One night, she woke to find it hovering over her, a formless mass of darkness with no discernible features. But she felt its intent, a hunger, a yearning to take her place in the world. Lila decided to confront the shadow one last time. She returned to the park where she had first seen it, carrying nothing but her sketchbook and a lantern. The park was eerily quiet, the trees swaying in a wind she couldn't feel. The shadow appeared almost instantly, pooling at her feet. This time it moved deliberately, forming a vague humanoid shape. A faint whisper echoed in the air, words she couldn't understand. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice breaking. The shadow reached toward her sketchbook. Pages flipped wildly until it stopped on the first drawing, the one with the distorted shadow. Slowly it pointed at her signature at the bottom of the page. "My name?" she asked, confused. "Why?" The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Then she understood. It wanted her identity, her existence. If she gave it her name, it would take her place in the world, leaving her trapped in its shadowy void. Lila knew she couldn't outrun the shadow. It had grown too strong, its presence an inescapable weight. But she wasn't ready to lose herself, to let the shadow win. She picked up her pencil and began to draw furiously in her sketchbook. The shadow hesitated, watching as she sketched a figure, a dark, featureless being, surrounded by light. "This is you," she whispered, her voice steady. "But you don't have to take me. I'll give you a form, an existence of your own." The shadow seemed to shiver, its edges flickering like a flame. Slowly it leaned into the page, merging with the drawing. Lila kept sketching, pouring every ounce of her will into the image, until the shadow was fully contained within the paper. The next morning, Lila awoke to find the shadow gone. The sketchbook lay on her desk, open to the page where the shadow's figure remained, now motionless and still. She felt a strange sense of relief, but also a lingering unease. She locked the sketchbook away, vowing never to open it again. But sometimes in the dead of night, she swore she could hear faint whispers coming from the drawer where it was hidden. A reminder that the shadow, though imprisoned, was still watching and waiting. For Cassie Delaney, the new job was a lifeline. After months of unemployment, she had finally landed a position as an administrative assistant at Vanguard Tower, one of the tallest buildings in the city. The skyscraper loomed over downtown, its reflective glass exterior shimmering under the sun, a testament to modernity and power. Cassie's first day was filled with the usual chaos of onboarding, filling out paperwork, meeting co-workers, and learning the layout of the immense building. The office was on the 27th floor, and like most employees, she relied on the sleek, high-speed elevators to navigate the tower. Stick to elevator C, her manager Mark advised during her tour. The others have been unreliable lately. Cassie laughed nervously, thinking he was joking. But as the day wore on, she noticed a strange tension among the staff whenever the elevators were mentioned. People avoided them unless absolutely necessary, and even then, they rarely rode alone. It was late when Cassie finished her work that evening. The office had emptied out, and the building's usual hum had quieted to an eerie stillness. She pressed the down button for elevator C and waited, the faint echo of her heels clicking against the marble floor. When the elevator doors slid open, she stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator began its descent, the hum of machinery steady and predictable. But then with a jolt, it stopped. Cassie frowned and checked the floor indicator above the doors. It read 13. That didn't make sense. Vanguard Tower didn't have a 13th floor. Like many superstitious buildings, it skipped straight from 12 to 14. Before she could process what was happening, the doors slid open. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, the air heavy with a metallic tang. The walls were bare concrete, smeared with what looked like rust, or perhaps something darker. There was no sound, no movement. Yet Cassie felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. She slammed the close doors button, her heart pounding as the elevator doors creaked shut. The car jolted back to life, continuing its descent as if nothing had happened. When the doors finally opened on the ground floor, she bolted out, shaking. The next morning, Cassie tried to rationalize what had happened. It had to be a glitch, she told herself, a miscalculation in the system. Still, curiosity nagged at her. During her lunch break, she approached the receptionist, a friendly woman named Jana. "Hey, Jana," Cassie began, keeping her tone light. "Have you ever noticed anything weird about the elevators?" Jana's smile faltered. She glanced around, lowering her voice. "You mean like the non-existent floors?" Cassie froze. "So it's not just me?" Jana sighed, her expression grim. "It's been happening for years. No one knows why. People have reported stopping on floors that aren't supposed to exist. Floors that don't show up on any blueprints. Most of the time, it's the 13th floor. But I've heard stories about others. Floors in the hundreds, floors where time doesn't move the same. Why doesn't anyone do anything about it?" Cassie asked, horrified. "They've tried. Inspectors, engineers, even priests. Nothing works. Management doesn't like us talking about it. Just avoid riding alone, okay?" A few weeks later, the office buzzed with unease. An employee named Tyler, one of the IT guys, hadn't shown up for work. His phone went straight to voicemail, and no one had seen him since he left the building the previous night. "Maybe he quit," someone suggested. "Without telling anyone?" Another coworker countered. "No way." Cassie couldn't shake the memory of her own experience in the elevator. She asked Jana if Tyler had mentioned anything unusual. Jana hesitated, then nodded. "He told me he stopped on the 13th floor a few days ago. Said he felt like something was trying to pull him out of the elevator. He laughed it off, but he looked terrified." That evening, Cassie found herself working late again. The office was silent, her co-workers long gone. She thought about taking the stairs but dismissed the idea. 27 floors were too many to walk after a long day. She pressed the button for elevator C, dread pooling in her stomach. The doors opened, and she stepped inside, holding her breath. The ride started smoothly, but her heart sank when the car shuddered to a stop. The floor indicator blinked, -1. There was no basement in Vanguard Tower. The doors opened, revealing a corridor bathed in a sickly green light. The walls were lined with old filing cabinets, their drawers slightly ajar. Faint whispers echoed in the distance, growing louder as Cassie stepped closer to the threshold. "Cassie?" Her name drifted through the air, distorted and hollow. She stumbled back, her pulse racing. The elevator doors began to close, and she lunged forward, slamming the open button. But something was in the doorway now. A shadow, tall and indistinct, stood just beyond the threshold. Its outline flickered like static, its face a void of shifting darkness. The whispers grew into a deafening roar as Cassie screamed and hit every button on the control panel. The doors finally shut, the elevator jerking upward with a groan. When it opened again on the 27th floor, she collapsed onto the carpet, sobbing. Cassie didn't return to work the next day. She spent hours researching Vanguard Tower, desperate for answers. Buried in obscure forums and local archives, she found fragmented stories about the building's construction. Workers had reported strange accidents during its early days. Fatal falls, sudden disappearances, tools vanishing without explanation. One article mentioned a construction foreman who had died on site. His body was found mangled in an elevator shaft, though no one could explain how he had fallen. Some say he never left, the article concluded. Determined to put an end to the terror, Cassie returned to the building after hours. She carried a flashlight, a notebook, and a small vial of holy water, just in case. She stepped into elevator C, her heart hammering in her chest. "Take me to the 13th floor," she whispered. The elevator shuddered, descending. The floor indicator flickered wildly before settling on 13. The doors opened, and Cassie stepped out. The hallway was as she remembered, dark, metallic, and wrong. But this time she didn't retreat. She walked forward, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The whispers grew louder, forming words she couldn't understand. At the end of the hallway, she found a door marked "Maintenance." Inside, the air was freezing, her breath visible in the dim light. A figure stood in the corner, a man wearing a hard hat, his body contorted unnaturally. His eyes glowed faintly, fixed on Cassie. "Leave," he rasped, his voice echoing, "or you'll never return." Cassie stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The door slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for the elevator, the whispers now a cacophony around her. When she finally reached the car and pressed the closed doors button, the shadowy figure lunged toward her. The doors shut just in time, and the elevator shot upward, faster than it ever had before. When it opened again on the ground floor, she ran out, vowing never to return. Cassie quit her job at Vanguard Tower and moved to a different city, far away from skyscrapers and their haunting elevators. But sometimes, late at night, she dreams of that shadowy figure and the whispers that followed her. And somewhere in Vanguard Tower, Elevator C still stops on floors that don't exist, waiting for its next passenger. It started as an urban legend. Whispers among university students, office workers, and late-night bloggers spoke of an unusual park hidden in the heart of the city. Official maps didn't mark it, and locals avoided discussing it openly. But those who stumbled across it swore something impossible happened there. Time flowed backward. People claimed to have seen leaves rising from the ground to reattach to trees, birds flying in reverse arcs, and footprints on the dirt path vanishing behind walkers. Strangest of all were the stories of people who entered the park and returned, speaking of glimpses into their past, forgotten moments, lost loves, or mistakes they wished they could undo. For some, it was a curiosity. For others, it became an obsession. Sophie Ward had never believed in urban legends. As a journalist for a small-town magazine, she prided herself on facts and hard evidence. But when her editor assigned her to investigate the backward park, she couldn't resist. The idea was too ridiculous to ignore, yet something about the story pulled at her. Her research revealed vague hints about the park's location. Somewhere near the older part of town, past streets lined with crumbling Victorian homes and overgrown gardens. She found blurry photos online, trees standing unnaturally still, a pond with ripples moving inward instead of outward. It all seemed too perfect to be true. One overcast afternoon, Sophie set out with her camera, a notebook, and a skeptical mind. It didn't take long before she stumbled upon it. The entrance was unassuming. A wrought iron gate rusted with age, partially obscured by ivy. A small wooden sign above the gate read, Chrysalis Park, in faded letters. Sophie pushed open the creaky gate, her heart racing with anticipation. The moment Sophie stepped into the park, the air felt different, heavier, charged like the moment before a thunderstorm. The chirping of birds was absent, replaced by an odd, faint hum. She wandered the winding paths, her sneakers crunching on gravel. At first, she saw nothing unusual, but then she noticed the leaves. A gust of wind sent them fluttering from the ground, upward. She froze, her camera clutched tightly as she watched the leaves reattach themselves to branches, as if rewinding a film. Her breath hitched. She continued walking, her pulse quickening with every step. By the time she reached the pond at the center of the park, her sense of reality had started to fray. The water rippled inward, creating perfect stillness at its center. Sophie stared at her reflection, watching as droplets of water leaped upward from the surface to rejoin a non-existent rain cloud. Her camera clicked as she captured image after image, though she doubted anyone would believe them. As Sophie ventured deeper, the park began to play tricks on her. She passed a bench where a couple sat, their movements unnaturally smooth, as though played in reverse. The man lifted his arm, his hand retreating from the woman's shoulder, their laughter swallowed into silence. She turned away, her head spinning. Her path led her to a small clearing where a swing set stood, eerily still. But as she approached, the swings began to move. Not forward, but backward, as if unseen children were unswinging themselves. The sight chilled her to the bone. Then she heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. Her name. Sophie! She spun around, her heart in her throat. The voice had sounded familiar, achingly so. She called out, but the park only answered with its strange hum. And yet, as she stood there, memories began to surface. Memories she hadn't thought of in years. Her mother's laughter when she was a child, her first heartbreak, the night her father left without saying goodbye. The park wasn't just reversing time, it was dredging up the past. In the park's farthest corner, Sophie found an old stone clock tower, its hands moving backward with a faint grinding noise. The tower was weathered and covered in ivy, but it radiated an undeniable power. Drawn to it, she pushed open its heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with dust. A spiral staircase wound upward, and Sophie climbed it cautiously, each step echoing in reverse, as though the tower itself resisted her presence. At the top, she found a room filled with clocks, antique pocket watches, ornate grandfather clocks, even digital alarm clocks, all ticking backward in perfect unison. At the center of the room stood an old man, his back to her. He wore a long coat, and his hair was a shock of white. When he turned, his face was lined with age, but his eyes sparkled with an unsettling clarity. "You've come to understand," he said simply. "Understand what?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "The park's purpose," he replied. "It shows us what we've lost, what we've forgotten, and sometimes, if we're lucky, it gives us a chance to change." Sophie's mind raced. "Change how?" "What do you mean?" The old man smiled sadly. "Time flows in one direction for a reason, but here it bends. It's not a gift, Sophie. It's a test." The old man gestured to a small mirror on the table beside him. "Look into it," he said. "See what you've left undone." Hesitant, Sophie stepped forward and gazed into the mirror. At first, she saw only her reflection, but then the image shifted, showing scenes from her past, her teenage years, her first love, the argument with her father the night he left. Her heart ached as she watched herself say words she wished she could take back. She saw the tears in her father's eyes as he walked out the door. "You can go back," the old man said, "but only once, and only at a cost." "What cost?" Sophie whispered. Your future, he replied. Every moment you change will alter the path ahead. You won't be the same person you are now. Sophie's hands trembled. The temptation was overwhelming, but so was the fear. She had spent years regretting that night with her father. But could she sacrifice her present for a chance to rewrite the past? The old man stepped aside, revealing a doorway glowing with golden light. The choice is yours, he said. Sophie stared at the doorway, her heart pounding. Memories of her father flooded her mind, mingling with the life she had built since then. Could she risk losing everything she had now for a chance to fix her mistakes? After what felt like an eternity, she shook her head. I can't, she said, tears streaming down her face. I have to live with what I've done. The old man nodded, his expression inscrutable. Wise, perhaps, he said, but the pain will remain. I'll find a way to live with it, Sophie replied. The room began to fade, the clocks slowing their backward march. As Sophie descended the spiral staircase, the park seemed to dissolve around her. When she stepped back through the wrought iron gate, the world outside felt brighter, sharper, as if time itself had reasserted its grip. Sophie never returned to Chrysalis Park, though the memories of that day stayed with her. She wrote about it in her article, though she left out the details of the clock tower and the old man. Most readers dismissed it as fiction, but a few reached out, sharing their own strange experiences with the park. For Sophie, the park became a reminder, not of what she had lost, but of what she still had. Time moved forward, as it always did, and she vowed to make the most of every moment. Because she knew, better than anyone, that some things could never be undone. The house at the end of Maple Lane had been abandoned for decades. No one in the small town of Eldermere dared approach it. The stories of strange occurrences and whispered legends had ensured that it remained untouched. Yet when Claire Evans inherited the property from a distant relative she'd never met, she saw it as an opportunity to escape her small apartment in the city. It's just an old house, she told herself as she drove up the overgrown driveway. The two-story Victorian loomed above her, its peeling paint and broken shutters casting eerie shadows in the late afternoon sun. Inside, the house was a time capsule. Dust-covered furniture, antique knickknacks, and faded wallpaper told of a life long abandoned. But it was the bay window in the upstairs study that immediately caught Claire's attention. The glass was pristine, untouched by dust or grime, and it gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. The frame was intricately carved with symbols Claire couldn't identify. She peered through it, expecting to see the unkempt garden below, but instead she saw something entirely different. The world beyond the window was lush and vibrant. Towering trees with silver leaves stretched toward a sky painted in swirling hues of gold and violet. Strange, bird-like creatures with iridescent feathers flitted between the branches. It was breathtaking and impossible. Claire spent hours staring through the window, unable to tear herself away. The scene beyond was alive, as if she were watching a real place rather than a painted landscape. Occasionally, she thought she saw figures moving in the distance, humanoid shapes darting between the trees. The next day, she tried opening the window, but it wouldn't budge. She tapped on the glass, and it felt solid, ordinary, yet the world beyond remained vivid and surreal. Determined to understand, Claire began researching. She scoured the house for clues and eventually found a journal tucked inside a drawer in the study. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Morley, her distant relative and the house's previous owner. In his meticulous handwriting, Elias described the window as a gateway. He had spent years studying it, convinced it wasn't just a portal to another world, but a two-way connection. That night, Claire dreamed of the world beyond the window. She walked through its forest, the soft glow of bioluminescent plants lighting her path. In the distance, she saw a figure standing beneath a massive tree. The figure raised a hand as if beckoning her closer, but before she could reach them, she woke up. The next morning, something was different. A faint smear marred the pristine glass of the window, a handprint, though it wasn't hers. Claire's heart raced. Was something trying to communicate with her? She placed her own hand against the glass, aligning it with the print, and felt a strange warmth. The colors in the window swirled and shifted, and for a moment she thought she heard whispers. She grabbed Elias's journal and flipped to the last entry, which read, "They are calling to me. I cannot ignore them any longer. If you are reading this, know that the window is not a blessing. It is a test." Claire couldn't ignore the pull of the window. It dominated her thoughts, consuming her every waking moment. Finally, she decided to see if the gateway could be activated. Following Elias's notes, she placed a series of objects on the windowsill: a silver coin, a feather, and a small vial of water. The moment she arranged them, the glass shimmered like water. She reached out cautiously, and her hand passed through the glass, as though it were a liquid veil. Heart pounding, Claire stepped through. The air on the other side was thick and sweet, carrying the scent of blooming flowers and rich earth. The world was even more vibrant up close. She marveled at the towering trees and glowing rivers, but the beauty was tempered by a sense of unease. In the distance, she saw figures. They were tall and ethereal, with elongated limbs and luminous eyes. They watched her in silence. The beings approached slowly, their movements fluid and deliberate. One stepped forward and spoke in a language Claire couldn't understand, yet somehow the meaning was clear. "You should not be here." Claire tried to explain that the window had drawn her, that she didn't mean to intrude. The being tilted its head. "The window is a bridge, but it is not meant for your kind." "Then why does it exist?" she asked. "To tempt," the being replied. "To test. Many have come before you, drawn by curiosity, but none have returned unchanged." The words sent a chill down Claire's spine. The beings led her to a massive tree with roots that seemed to pulse with life. Beneath it, she saw countless objects: watches, jewelry, books, and more. Each item radiated a faint energy. "These are the remnants of those who came before," one being explained. "They left pieces of themselves behind, willingly or not. The window feeds on what it takes." "What did it take from them?" Claire asked. "Their memories, their hopes." "Their souls," Claire stumbled back, horrified. "I didn't agree to this." "You did the moment you crossed," the being said. "But you have a choice. Leave now, and the window will close to you forever. Stay, and you may find what you seek, but at great cost." Claire was torn. The world beyond the window was mesmerizing, but the being's warnings echoed in her mind. If she stayed, what would she lose? Could she truly risk it? The beings watched her silently as she wrestled with her decision. Finally, she turned back toward the shimmering portal. "I can't stay," she said. The beings nodded solemnly. "Then go and do not return. The window's temptations grow stronger each time it is crossed." Claire stepped through the portal, back into the dusty study. She turned to look at the window, but the vibrant world was gone. All she saw was her reflection in the glass. For days after, Claire felt a strange emptiness. She couldn't remember certain parts of her life, fragments of her childhood, the faces of old friends. It was as if pieces of her had been plucked away. The window remained silent, its surface dull and lifeless. Yet at night, Claire dreamed of the world beyond. She dreamed of the beings and their luminous eyes, of the endless forest and its secrets. And sometimes, just before she woke, she heard whispers, "The window waits." It was a gray, dreary day when Emma stumbled upon the little antique shop on Willow Street. The sign above the door creaked in the wind, reading, "Timeless Treasures." Emma had never noticed the shop before, despite living in the town for years. Something about it drew her in, though she couldn't explain why. Inside, the shop smelled of aged wood and faintly of lavender. The place was packed with trinkets, dusty books, faded photographs, and ornate furniture. Emma wandered aimlessly until her eyes caught a peculiar item at the back of the shop, a tall, elegant grandfather clock. The clock was unlike any she had ever seen. Its face was cracked, and the hands were frozen at 11:58. Beneath the clock face, there was a small, ornate dial with a countdown. 7 days, 14 hours, 22 minutes, 45 seconds. "Isn't she magnificent?" came a raspy voice. Emma turned to see the shopkeeper, an elderly man with spectacles perched on his nose. "How much is it?" she asked, intrigued. The shopkeeper hesitated. "It's not for everyone," he said cryptically. "This clock has a history, but if you truly want it, it's yours." Against her better judgment, Emma bought the clock and had it delivered to her home. The clock fit perfectly in the corner of Emma's living room, its dark wood gleaming even in the dim light. She noticed the countdown immediately. 7 days, 12 hours, 10 minutes, 30 seconds. She couldn't figure out what it was counting down to. Was it broken? She tried winding it, but the hands remained stuck at 11:58. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. The air around the clock seemed colder, and Emma often felt as though she were being watched. At night, she swore she heard faint ticking, though the clock itself was silent. By the fourth day, the countdown read 3 days, 4 hours, 22 minutes. Emma began to have vivid nightmares, visions of shadowy figures, whispering voices in a dark, endless void. Desperate for answers, Emma decided to learn more about the clock. She returned to the antique shop, but to her shock, Timeless Treasures was gone. In its place was an empty storefront with boarded-up windows. Emma's next stop was the library. She searched old town records and newspaper archives, hoping to find something about the clock's origins. After hours of digging, she found an article from 1887, "Mysterious Clock Found at Site of Factory Fire." The article described a devastating fire that had killed 13 workers at a clock-making factory. The only item recovered from the ashes was a grandfather clock, which had somehow survived unscathed. The factory's owner, a man named Thomas Huxley, claimed the clock was cursed. "It doesn't tell time," he had said. "It counts down to doom." By the 6th night, Emma was barely sleeping. The clock's countdown now read 12 hours, 34 minutes. She couldn't escape the feeling that something terrible would happen when the clock reached 0. The nightmares intensified. That night, she dreamed of a figure standing by the clock, a man with hollow eyes and charred skin. He reached out to her and whispered, "The time is near." Emma woke up in a cold sweat. The clock's face seemed to glow faintly in the dark room, and she swore she heard faint whispers emanating from it. She decided to destroy the clock. Grabbing a hammer, she swung at the ornate wood, but the hammer bounced off as though the clock were made of steel. Frustrated and terrified, she screamed, "What do you want from me?" The clock gave no answer, but the ticking grew louder. As the countdown ticked down to its final hours, Emma became increasingly desperate. She called her friend Mark, a skeptic with a knack for solving mysteries. "This is ridiculous," Mark said when he saw the clock. "It's just an old piece of junk. The countdown is probably part of some mechanical quirk." But as the countdown hit 2 hours, 15 minutes, Mark's confidence wavered. The room grew colder, and a strange shadow seemed to creep across the walls. "Maybe we should leave," Mark suggested, his voice shaky. "No," Emma said. "I need to see this through." As the final minute approached, Emma and Mark sat silently in the living room, staring at the clock. The air was thick with tension. When the countdown hit 0, the clock chimed, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to shake the entire house. The frozen hands on the clock face began to move, ticking forward to midnight. A blinding light filled the room. Emma and Mark shielded their eyes, and when the light faded, they found themselves in a completely different place. They were standing in the middle of a barren landscape, the sky an ominous shade of gray. The clock stood before them, its countdown reset to 7 days. Around it, shadowy figures began to emerge, their faces pale and expressionless. One of the figures stepped forward. It was the man from Emma's dreams, the factory owner, Thomas Huxley. "This is the clock's realm," he said, his voice echoing. "It was created to hold the souls of those who tamper with time. Each cycle, it chooses someone to join us." Emma's heart sank. "But I didn't do anything." "You brought it into your home," Huxley said, "and now you are part of its story." Emma refused to accept her fate. She begged Huxley for a way out. "There is one way," he said reluctantly. "You must reset the clock before the next cycle ends. But beware, the clock does not like to be denied." Emma and Mark scrambled to the clock, searching for a way to reset it. As they did, the shadowy figures began to close in, their whispers growing louder. Mark found a hidden latch at the back of the clock. With a twist, the countdown reset to 7 days, 14 hours. The figures let out an ear-piercing wail and began to dissolve. Emma and Mark woke up back in her living room. The clock was gone, and the room was eerily silent. Though they were relieved to be free, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the clock wasn't truly gone. Somewhere it was waiting for its next owner, its countdown ready to begin again. In the small, sleepy town of Briarwood, there was a playground that every child knew but few dared to visit after dusk. Located at the edge of Willow Creek Woods, the old playground was surrounded by stories, most of them eerie. Parents warned their children to stay away, especially during full moons. The centerpiece of the playground was an old wooden swing set. The swings were ancient, with weathered chains and seats that creaked ominously even on calm days. During full moons, the townsfolk swore the swings moved on their own, as if an invisible child was playing. For 12-year-old Ellie and her best friend Jonah, ghost stories were nothing more than entertainment. They'd spent countless nights in Ellie's basement, daring each other to watch horror movies and swapping urban legends. The tale of the whispering swings, however, intrigued them the most. "Do you think it's true?" Ellie asked one afternoon, staring at the playground through the trees from her bedroom window. "No way," Jonah said confidently. "It's just the wind or some old chains rusting. Let's check it out on the next full moon." Ellie hesitated. The stories of the playground weren't just about moving swings. There were whispers of children hearing faint laughter or seeing shadowy figures darting through the woods. But her curiosity outweighed her fear. On the night of the full moon, Ellie and Jonah snuck out of their homes with flashlights. The playground looked different under the silver glow of the moon, the shadows of the trees stretching like fingers across the ground. "See? Nothing creepy," Jonah said, though his voice wavered slightly. Ellie approached the swing set. The two swings swayed gently, though the air was still. She reached out and touched one of the chains. It was cold, almost unnaturally so. "It's probably just a draft," Jonah muttered. Suddenly, the swing beside her moved, its motion slow and deliberate, as if someone had just climbed on. Both kids froze, their flashlights trembling. A faint whisper drifted through the air, so soft it was almost indistinguishable from the rustling leaves. "Did you hear that?" Ellie whispered. Jonah nodded. Let's just go." But as they turned to leave, the whisper grew louder. It wasn't just random sounds, it was a voice. "Push me," it said, faint and childlike. Ellie spun around, her heart hammering. The swing closest to her was now moving faster, as if someone were pumping their legs to gain height. "Who's there?" she called, her voice cracking. The whisper came again. "Push me." Jonah grabbed Ellie's arm. "We need to get out of here." But Ellie was transfixed. She couldn't shake the feeling that the voice was coming from someone who needed help. Against her better judgment, she stepped closer to the swing set. When she reached out to touch the moving swing, the world around her shifted. The cold air disappeared, replaced by the sound of children laughing. The playground was no longer empty. It was alive with children running, playing tag and swinging. Ellie turned to Jonah, but he wasn't there. Ellie felt as if she were in a dream. The children didn't seem to notice her. She watched as a small boy, no older than 6, ran to the swings. His face was familiar, though she couldn't place where she'd seen it before. "Push me," he called, his voice exactly like the whisper she had heard. Ellie hesitated. "Who are you?" she asked. The boy stopped swinging and turned to look at her, his expression somber. "We're the forgotten one," he said. "The ones they left behind." "Left behind where?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling. But before the boy could answer, the laughter faded and the scene dissolved. Back in the real world, Jonah was panicking. Ellie had vanished the moment she touched the swing. Desperate, he ran to her house and explained everything to her parents. Ellie's father, a history enthusiast, was immediately alarmed. He retrieved an old town ledger and began flipping through its brittle pages. "Willow Creek Wood," he muttered, his finger tracing a line of text. "This area was once home to a small orphanage. It burned down over 100 years ago. The children, most of them, were never found." Jonah's stomach dropped. "What do we do?" Her father hesitated. "The swings. They might be tied to the children. If Ellie's still there, she's trapped with them." Ellie was still in the dreamlike world of the past. The boy on the swing had disappeared, and the playground was eerily silent. "Why am I here?" she called out, her voice echoing. A figure stepped out from the shadows. It was the boy again. "You can help us," he said, "but you have to listen." He explained that the swings were the last remnants of their lives. They were bound to them, reliving their final moments every full moon. "We just want someone to remember us," he said, his voice breaking. Jonah and Ellie's father arrived at the playground with an old photo from the town ledger. It showed the orphanage children, including the boy Ellie had seen. Jonah placed the photo on the swing set and whispered, "We remember you." In Ellie's world, the boy smiled. "It's time," he said. "Thank you." The children gathered around the swings, their forms fading into the moonlight. Ellie blinked and found herself back in the present, Jonah shaking her shoulder. The swings never moved on their own again. The townsfolk noticed, and the eerie stories faded. Ellie often visited the playground, leaving flowers by the swing set as a tribute to the forgotten children who had finally found peace. Lila loved exploring antique shops. She found a certain charm in objects with history, imagining the stories they carried through the years. One rainy afternoon, while wandering through an unfamiliar part of town, she stumbled upon an old shop named Ethereal Curiosities. The shop was dimly lit, its shelves crammed with peculiar trinkets, brass candlesticks, faded paintings, and jewelry that glittered faintly under a dusty chandelier. On a small wooden table in the back corner, Lila noticed a pocket mirror with an intricately carved silver frame. The design caught her eye, roses twisting around the edges, their vines forming delicate patterns. The glass was slightly cloudy but reflected her face with an oddly sharp clarity. "How much for this?" Lila asked the shopkeeper, an elderly man with piercing blue eyes. He looked at the mirror and hesitated. "That one's unique," he said. $5, but be careful with it." "Careful?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. The man simply nodded. "It's old, fragile, and strange things have been said about it." Lila laughed nervously. "I'll take it." That evening, Lila placed the mirror on her nightstand. As she brushed her hair, she picked it up and admired its craftsmanship. Tilting it slightly, she noticed something odd. In the reflection, there was a shadowy figure standing just behind her. Her breath caught. She spun around, but the room was empty. Heart pounding, she stared back at the mirror, but the figure was gone. "It's just an old mirror," she told herself. trying to laugh off her unease. Probably a trick of the light. Over the next few days, strange occurrences began to unfold. Every time Lila looked into the mirror, she saw fleeting glimpses of the shadowy figure. Sometimes it was just a silhouette. Other times it appeared closer, its features slightly more defined, a tall figure with sunken eyes and a twisted, eerie smile. She started to avoid the mirror, but no matter where she placed it, it seemed to draw her gaze. One night, unable to sleep, she decided to return to the antique shop and ask the shopkeeper about its history. When she arrived, the shop was closed, its windows boarded up as if it had been abandoned for years. Confused and unnerved, Lila searched online for ethereal curiosities, but found no record of its existence. Lila's paranoia grew. The figure began appearing in other reflective surfaces, windows, puddles, even her phone's camera, but only when she was holding the pocket mirror. One evening, as she was examining the mirror under a bright desk lamp, she noticed an engraving on the back. "He who peers too long shall find a companion in shadows." A chill ran down her spine. Was the mirror cursed? Was the figure real? Determined to get rid of it, Lila threw the mirror into a trash bin far from her apartment. She felt relief for the first time in days, but that night the figure returned. This time it wasn't confined to the mirror. Lila woke up to find her room colder than usual, a faint whisper echoing in her ears. Desperate, Lila confided in her best friend Emma. Skeptical but concerned, Emma agreed to help her investigate. They went to a local historian who specialized in antique objects. When he saw a photo of the mirror, his face went pale. "That's the mirror of shadows," he said. "It's said to show the spirits of those who've been forgotten or wronged in life. They attach themselves to the mirror's owner, drawn to the reflections." "How do I get rid of it?" Lila asked. The historian frowned. "Destroying it might anger the spirit. You need to find a way to sever its connection peacefully. Perhaps return it to where it came from." With no way to locate the antique shop, Lila tried to communicate with the spirit through the mirror. She lit candles, surrounded herself with salt, and held the mirror tightly. "Who are you?" she asked. The reflection shifted. For the first time, the figure appeared fully formed, a woman with hollow eyes and a mournful expression. The spirit's name was Margaret, a seamstress who had lived in the early 1900s. Betrayed by her fiancé and falsely accused of theft, Margaret had been shunned by her community. Heartbroken and alone, she died clutching the mirror, her only prized possession. Her spirit, consumed by grief and bitterness, became bound to the mirror, seeking solace in the reflections of others. Moved by Margaret's story, Lila promised to help her find peace. She visited Margaret's hometown, scouring old records to uncover the truth of her tragic life. After weeks of research, Lila located Margaret's unmarked grave in a neglected cemetery. She placed the mirror on the grave and said, "Margaret, you were wronged, but your story is remembered now. Rest in peace." The air grew still, and for a moment, Lila felt a warm presence. When she looked at the mirror one last time, Margaret's reflection smiled softly before fading away. Lila buried the mirror beside Margaret's grave, sealing the curse. The whispers ceased, and her life returned to normal. Though she no longer visited antique shops, she often thought of Margaret. Her experience had taught her that some objects carry more than memories. They carry the echoes of lives long past, waiting to be heard.